College. We're going to move right into our keynote address before lunch and our panel on the state of the election. And we're very pleased to have Ms. Salena Zito as our keynote speaker, even though she was up into the wee hours of the night last night covering the election yesterday. Salena Zito is a fifth-generation news reporter. She is a national political reporter for the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review, a Trib editorial page columnist, and host of Off-Road Politics on Trib Live Radio. Ms. Zito blogs about national and Pennsylvania politics for Trib Live at blog.triblive.com and has reported on Pennsylvania politics for the Weekly Standard. Ms. Zito has been a finalist in 2010, 2012, and 2015 for the Golden Quill Award for the Press Club of Western PA for her columns. She won an honorable mention from the Pennsylvania Women's Press Association in 2011, and she's the only reporter to have won 3 Clarion Awards, a prestigious national award for women covering the news. She has experience working on campaigns and has served on the Senate staff of U.S. Senator Arlen Specter. Her reporting has included interviews with figures such as Donald Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, and Laura Bush. And over the past 5 months, Ms. Zito has interviewed Martin O'Malley, Carly Fiorina, Rand Paul, John Kasich, Jeb Bush, Bobby Jindal, Marco Rubio, other presidential candidates that have since dropped out. Interviews, all of which are available on offroad.triblive.com. So check that out. And please give a warm welcome to our speaker, Ms. Salena Zito. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Trying to bring prepared remarks, but as he said, I was up until 1 in the morning covering the Pennsylvania races last night. I know you're not all from Pennsylvania or from here, but did anybody vote yesterday? Yay! It's really important, even in an off-year election, to participate in the vote. Not enough people do that. And it's an important part of what we do in this country, that people should participate in more. Now, as he explained, I cover national politics. So when it's not a presidential year, I'm covering U.S. Senate races or congressional races, which are just as important as the presidential race, because those pick the majorities of who represent the country in Washington. So, and as he said, and you didn't mention all of them, but I have interviewed every single person running for president right now on the Democrat and Republican side. It's something that I started out doing in November of last year, and it took me an entire year to get, I think, a total of 26 interviews done. But it was a fascinating process. I'm very lucky. I get to go to Iowa and to New Hampshire and cover the candidates, but more importantly, cover the people, because those are the people that ultimately decide what happens in an election cycle. In the long, complicated process of winning the presidency, no one can ever be too certain who will come out on top. 2 things that have always surprised me in every election cycle: how little is retained from the revolving door patterns of the last cycle. In other words, there's always a whack-a-mole process. Think of it this way: you see a bunch of heads popping off, and someone will jump up to the top and they get whacked down by the scrutiny of the press and by the scrutiny of the voters, and then another one pops up. So whoever is on top in July or August or now will most likely not be the ultimate winner for the party's nomination, unless you have a smaller field like the Democrats. But right now for the Republicans, their field is larger. So you see entertainer Donald Trump and physician Ben Carson at the top, but I would argue they are unlikely to be the Republicans' nominee. The thing that stuns me, though, in every election cycle is how little Americans know about the history of electing presidents. Everyone seems to live in sort of the arrogance of the moment, believing this is the first time that this has ever happened in our history. They could not be more wrong. The 2016 campaign's big crop of candidates from Republican side is nothing new. Throughout American history, a large number of candidates have run for their party's nomination. In 1924, there were 41 candidates on the ballot for president for the Democrats. 41. That makes this size look really, really small. And if you want to get up closer to more modern history, 1988 had 14 Democrats running for president, including 2 men who would ultimately become vice presidents in this country, Al Gore and Joe Biden. And as far as rambunctious campaigns go, I mean, everybody looks at this and thinks, oh my God, this is like unprecedented. This has never happened before. Just take a look at the era between the Civil War and the Gilded Age. And this is an electorate in this time period that had seen 2 presidential assassinations, a presidential impeachment, and 1 contested campaign. The political climate was incredibly intense, was incredibly crazy, and filled with antics, but it also garnered the highest turnout ever in our election history. Which brings us to today. On the Republican side, we have a dozen of diverse candidates, 1 woman, 2 Hispanics, a black neurosurgeon, an entertainer, the brother and son of 1 U.S. president, former governors and U.S. senators, and the governor of Ohio who grew up right across the hill from this university, John Kasich. He is from McKees Rocks. He's the son of two postal workers and came from very humble beginnings. In fact, there are a total of 4 people that are from Pittsburgh on both sides of the aisle that are running for president. Rand Paul, Martin O'Malley, John Kasich, and Carly Fiorina's husband. Well, he's not running. There's still an interesting amount of roots coming from Western Pennsylvania. On the Democratic side, we have a former First Lady who was also a U.S. Senator from New York and Secretary of State and socialist, and that's with a small s, not big, senator from Vermont, and Governor O'Malley, who was from the north side of Pittsburgh. What makes this cycle unique is not that it is occurring during a populist moment in the electorate. Now, populism means voters are more amplified and more angry with the status quo or with Washington. What makes it unique is that the anger is more amplified because of social media. But do not be fooled by that. It is unlikely that the intensity that you will find on Twitter or Facebook is going to be reflected in the voter count. In short, despite the insurgency candidates of Donald Trump for the Republicans and Bernie Sanders for the Democrats, they tend to serve as sort of antibodies to the status quo. So if you dig deep and look at the polls right now, if you look at the polls, it's Donald Trump or Ben Carson. But if you dig down and look at the numbers, if you take Jeb Bush out of the equation and you do head-to-head matchups with like Trump and Rubio or Trump and Ted Cruz or Trump and Chris Christie, all of a sudden Donald Trump has absolutely no power. He drops down 20 points. It's almost as if you take Jeb Bush, who is considered sort of the ultimate establishment candidate, and that is what people are railing against, then the antibody, which is what I call Donald Trump, loses its power, right? It doesn't have any more power, and the election becomes more buoyant, more fluid, more normal. As a national political reporter for the Trib, I have had the opportunity, as I said before, to have interviewed all of the candidates in all kinds of different settings. So some have been literally in a closet at the Willard Hotel in Washington. Some have been in almost the bathroom at a bar in Iowa. And some have been running down the road with a candidate. But I've seen them in all sort of different ways that you guys don't get to see them because you just see snippets of them or you see snippets against them. But the country is very lucky to have such a diverse and interesting crowd of people to be running, and it's important to be engaged and follow. And I think one of the most important things to do as an informed voter is to not view the process through your team size. What we tend to do these days is wear a blue shirt or a red shirt. Basically, we're either Republican or we're Democrat. We put our shirt on. That's what we watch on social media. That's what website that we go to. And we don't get a more diverse view of what these candidates are and what they stand for. I'd encourage everyone to go counterintuitive to what your firm beliefs are and be a little more enlightened about what these guys stand for. So I know you guys have a ton of questions. So I'm going to start babbling, and I would love to hear from you and anything you want to ask me about the process, about the interviews, who I think's the funniest, whatever you want to know, please feel free to ask.
Who's your favorite person to interview?
Favorite, like, ever or in this cycle?
Both.
My favorite person to interview would have been David Petraeus. I interviewed him in 2000. I interviewed him right at the beginning of the surge. No. Beginning of the surge, and he was the general under President Obama. So he stayed under both administrations. And it was a very intense time. People did not know how things were going to happen. We were losing badly, not only on the ground in Iraq, but with the Americans were losing the story about Iraq. And he was very deliberate and thoughtful and very open. A 15-minute interview took 2.5 hours. I would say the second person the most interesting person that I've interviewed, I don't know if a favorite, but like interesting, was Hillary Clinton. She came into the newspaper after much begging, and again, it was supposed to be a 15-minute interview. We're not going to talk about, everything's going to be tightly scripted, blah, blah, blah. Like, that's what it came in with. And we're like, yeah, sure. That's not what happened. 2.5 hours later, after taking questions, very intense questions about everything from what's going on in Egypt to how to bring back the economy, to some of the things that she has said that have come back to haunt her. She was very open and calm and deliberate. If anybody saw her during the Benghazi hearings, that was her. She was very confident in her words. Come on, you guys.
You talked about how Jeb Bush is the establishment candidate on the Republican side. How is Hillary coming across as is she more of the established candidate on the Democrat side?
She's definitely the establishment candidate.
And is it hurting her as much as it is Jeb?
What's hurting, the Democrats have a problem that a lot of people haven't paid attention to. They have, since 2009, down ballot. Now, what I mean by down ballot is the congressional seats and the state legislative seats. They have lost 900 seats. 900 seats in I can't do math, in 7 years. They've lost 6 years. And they have lost 70 in addition to that congressional seats. So what that means is there is not a great bench. Think of it as sports. You've got your star players, then you've got your bench that can come in and go get up there and play the game. They don't have a big bench. So the Democrats have to settle quicker because they don't have a lot of choices. So their populist candidate, Bernie Sanders, initially did a really great job. But, as she presented herself in the Benghazi hearings and in the debate, the populism faded off. Now, while populism is still going on with the Republican Party, and I'd still argue still with the Democratic Party, they just don't have a whole lot of choices. We have never in our history ever elected a populist president. We've never done that. People think that Andrew Jackson was a populist. He wasn't. If you go back and look at his rhetoric when he ran for president, he was the everyman, but he also ran as the natural inherent of George Washington. as someone who was in war, as someone who was a general, as someone who led men. And so while the people were feeling populist, Jackson was not a populist. So we have never, while there all this frenzy's going on, and you look at Trump and you look at Carson and you look at Sanders, the reality is, unless we, break the cycle, we will probably not elect a populist this time.
There might be on the right, there might be an opportunity, though, for the nomination of a populist candidate. Might be a rare window. A lot of pundits are saying there's a window in which this could happen, and that'd be very, very rare in presidential elections. If that happens, what do you think are the implications of that in the likely event that it turns out to be a stunning loss, as I think they're projecting it would be?
If the Republicans elect a populist candidate, it is unlikely that they would win the presidency. First of all, populism is, it's a lot of energy. So think about 2006, when the Democrats in the midterm election were very angry, swing Democrats, especially like Reagan Democrats, were very angry with the Bush administration about the Iraq War and about big spending. And so while they had been voting Republican, they just had enough. And the Democrats wisely picked very moderate candidates to run in very swing districts, and the Democrats just crushed the Republicans in that midterm election. You saw the same thing happen in reverse in 2010 and in 2014. But those were more what I call brake pedal elections. So while there was a lot of energy behind them, what they were telling Washington is, we want to stop. So 2010 was a reaction to the stimulus. It was a reaction to bailing out big banks. It was a reaction to the healthcare law. They put the brakes on Washington. They did it again in 2014. But these populist cycles, they can't last more than 2 years. Like, everybody keeps saying the word Tea Party. The Tea Party began in 2009 and it ended in 2011. The Tea Party had still been around in 2012 as people thought it still was. My profession talked about the Tea Party endlessly. Tea Party wasn't around. Mitt Romney would be president if Tea Party was around. It was done. But that's the problem. People don't understand history. They don't understand the electorate. They look at it from here, and they don't look at it from down here. That's sort of one of the great things about my newspaper, is that while I get to interview these guys, far more interesting to me is interviewing the people in Iowa, getting on a back road and talking to them. That's where you can gauge where an election cycle is going. In 2014, I had predicted absolutely every seat that was won in Congress, in the House, in the Senate. I knew the Republicans were going to crush it. But even in the weeks coming up to the election last year, everyone was saying that, oh, Kansas is going to go Democrat. The Republican candidate in Kansas won by 12 percentage points. How can you get it that wrong? And I think that's because you don't go out there and talk to people. So I'm not talking to the candidate. He's going to say all the safe things. It's about talking to the people that are on the ground. That's how you understand what's happening. So get back to your question. I still don't think that, based on all the traveling that I have done this year, I still don't think that a Donald Trump or a Ben Carson's going to win. We're still in that whack-a-mole process where these candidates rise up, they get scrutiny, they get attention, and they go away. You think back to Rudy Giuliani. He was going to be the nominee in 2008. Well, that didn't last. Think about Michelle Bachmann or Herman Cain or Newt Gingrich. They were going to be the nominee in 2012. That didn't last either. Once the scrutiny is looked at, not only by the media, but by the voters, that populism and that energy tends to soften, and people tend to go for, they tend to think more than you think they do.
having that experience with the people, do you agree with Dr. Rice's prediction for the electoral vote outcome?
No.
Okay.
No, no. If you saw when she said that, I was like, no. I mean, while the Republicans sort of look a little crazy right now, I would argue that the Democrats have a lot of problems. They are a very fractured party. The progressives are not happy. The middle Democrats, the ones that you typically find in Western Pennsylvania or anywhere outside of a large city, are not as liberal as the Washington Democrats. They just have sort of different viewpoints. Their lifestyle is different. The way they view the world is different. And what happens is they either do one of two things. They either just don't show up to vote, which is what Republicans did in the last election, or they cross over. So I think this is going to be, once again, a very close election cycle. We are pretty much split half and half, and it's going to come down to, as it always does, is the squishy middle. Who's able to persuade the independent voter to go their way? And another thing you'll see, and President Obama was incredible at this. I don't think anybody else was as incredible at this than Nixon. In class warfare and in dividing people. When you have class warfare and when you have divisional politics, what happens is people stay home. So in 2012, there were, I forget how many, it was several million people that did not, who showed up in 2008 for President Obama, who did not show up in 2012. In 2008, he ran a very aspirational candidacy. I spent weeks with him. It was very inspiring. In 2012, he knew, because of the anger left over from the Tea Party, that the only way to clinch that again was to persuade them that Mitt Romney was so offensive that they just shouldn't show up, and that's what they did. I mean, all's fair in love and war. Nixon did the same thing when he won. That's what you either have two kinds of presidential campaigns: aspirational or class warfare.
I think maybe I can be heard because this doesn't seem like it's done. All right. I, too, last night was with a large group of the politicians, Rich Fitzgerald, senators, because I've been in the system for a while. And I had a conversation with the most powerful senator in the Senate that's a Democrat. I won't name him at the moment. But since we're discussing that, last night there was a very big shift. The Republicans now control the state legislature, and they can override any vote that the Governor Wolf makes now. They're in control. So when I walked up behind him quietly, I've known him for about 25 years, I said, "You have a Teflon suit. You have done quite well in politics." And he turned and looked at me and he said, "Not now." He said, "I don't know what's going to happen." So what you're saying, if you actually get into politics and you know a lot of these people, you begin to know what's going on. And one of the things is, I taught political science for years. At one time, I did teach at the university, Appalachian University. But I decided as a teacher, you don't know anything. So for years, I've been out there knowing all of them, and you get a different picture.
Absolutely.
And also, as far as I'm concerned, I'm a Democrat, but I did run for office, and I asked Republicans to help me because I could cross-file. And basically, you should never shut it out. I've got friends that are rabid Democrats. I said, you would vote for a rabid dog before you'd vote for a Republican. That is a bad, bad view.
Yeah.
You should have both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would argue last night the Republicans won the moment. Right? They won the supermajority in the state legislature, but the Democrats won the future. Right. They routed the Republicans in the Supreme Court races, which are the most important races. Now, while which is an interesting thing to me, because the Democrats in this state are they're just a mess. They're just an absolute mess. The Republicans in this state really got their act together, but the Democrats got the unions and the trial lawyers to invest in these judicial races, and they just crushed Republicans at their own game. So they won the future because the Supreme Court is the one that decides redistricting. Redistricting is how you get a majority. So in the end of the day, the Democrats won the war.
This isn't really about the national elections, but you said that you covered a lot of state politics also. How are people like us able to follow the state politics, people that don't really read newspapers and stuff like that?
Okay, well, our newspaper's online, so you could read our newspaper online. I would argue you're a newspaper, and I'm just saying this because I'm a news person, a fifth-generation news person. Newspapers are a very important part of your life. You can read the editorial section, that's where you'll get your partisan slant, but you should really read. We are very blessed in this city. There are 2 newspapers. You should be reading both of them every day. And they have excellent online content. That is the best way to get your information. A blog is typically going to be a right blog or a left blog. A newspaper's job is to objectively put the story out there. Now, if you go to the opinion page, you're going to get opinion. But I would argue the way to be most informed is to go to your local newspapers and read them. They're going to be a lot more insightful and a lot more in-depth than, a blog is going to be.
Well, this is a more personal question. I was just wondering what exactly continues your drive to do this, because we're all interested in politics, which is why we're here. So I was just wondering what motivates you and keeps you going, because politics is such a
It's
diverse
exhausting.
world. Yeah.
It's so exhausting. It really is. I'm up at the morning. I do a lot of social media. I'd love for you guys to follow me. I promise I'll follow you back. It's at Salena Zito Trib. So that's at SALENA ZITO Trib. I post a lot of stuff when I'm on the road, of my stories. I interact with a lot of people. I love social media. It's a lot of fun. But covering politics is exhausting. It's emotionally exhausting. Having said that, you're covering history. You are in the moment of history. And it's always important when you cover politics to have an understanding of what has happened before. It gives you a much better appreciation for what you're doing and a much more, I always tell people, people died so we could vote. This is really important, people. And even though sometimes politics make you want to throw your hands up and say, oh my God, these people are crazy. Not any more crazier than we have always been. We had a whiskey rebellion right here, basically in this, where we're standing. Where a sitting U.S. president, George Washington, dressed as a general to come down and whoop our ass because we didn't want to pay taxes. Now, the taxes were, I would argue, unfair. Is everyone familiar what happened with the Whiskey Rebellion? Okay. So, the taxes were unfair. The elites were making farmers pay for tax on their only revenue, which was grain, which they were turning into whiskey. They didn't have the sort of luxury that people in, say, Virginia had in sort of having their hands, or in Philadelphia, where commerce was happening right there in Philly in the market, or right there in New York, or right there in Richmond. They had to, their product would spoil, so they turned it into whiskey, and that's how they bartered and trade. They didn't have money. We didn't even have a national currency at that time. But they slapped this huge tax on everyone. And they were like, I'm not paying a tax. I mean, I swear people in Western Pennsylvania have not changed. We have that same DNA just sort of bred into us. We're always like, It's so much more than any other part of the state. So I would argue that if you want to cover politics, you want to stay interested in politics, is always try to sort of take a look at what has happened before in our past. It really gives you, it keeps you in an even keel. When Donald Trump came out and everyone was like, oh my God, he's going to be the nominee, and hair's on fire, I would argue, look at the Know Nothing Party in the 1850s. I mean, does anybody here know about the Know Nothing Party? Yeah, we were crazy. But we didn't elect a Know Nothing president. And in the end, that populist movement, the end result was Abraham Lincoln, because all that energy went somewhere else, which has always happened. We cannot sustain energy to the level that we have right now. It will always, always dissipate after about 2 years. So when everyone says to you, oh, well, the Tea Party this, you just tell them, Tea Party ended in 2011, know your history. Because there is a populist movement right now. And it goes across both parties, and it has no name. And that's what sort of confounds my profession. They do not understand this because they can't name it, and they can't make money off of it. They can't do what they did to the Tea Party, where every other company sprouts up and their name is like Patriot or Liberty or Freedom. They're just a bunch of hucksters making money off of people's fears. The Tea Party ended in 2011. And if you don't believe that, look at what the 2012 presidential results. Well, last night was a really interesting night election-wise across the country, with the exception of Pennsylvania, where the Republicans just got slapped. The Republicans across the country, in California, in Houston, in Kentucky, and in Virginia, had very, very good nights. If you look later on today in my blog post, I'll take a look at all the races that there were. Oh, in Mississippi, too. There was, while the truck driver lost in Mississippi, the Democrat. Did anybody know about this guy? Oh, my God, it's my favorite story. He runs for the Democratic primary in Mississippi. There were two well-funded African-American women who were, one of the two were expected to win this. Well, he never campaigns. He didn't even tell his family that he was running. He didn't even show up on election day to vote for himself. And he won with 40% of the vote. A truck driver. It was the best. Now, he lost yesterday, but that shows you that there's populism in the Democratic Party. Mississippi has a very active electorate. They're very engaged, and it was a fascinating race to me. So if anybody says to you, oh, the Republicans are the only ones that are angry, I would point to that race and say, pay attention, because the Democrats have problems too. Any other questions?
Well, thanks for that comment about the electorate in Mississippi. I'm wondering about Iowa and New Hampshire. And I don't know if you could kind of paint a profile of those voters. Are they different than voters in the rest of the country who kind of follow their lead when it comes to presidential candidates?
Well, everyone thinks that what happens in Iowa is happen across the country. Iowa is a very beautiful state. I really enjoy going there, but it is a very white state. And I don't think it is reflective of the rest of this country. And I think that their Democrats tend to be more liberal, and the Republicans tend to be more conservative. So I think the possibility exists that you might see Bobby Jindal win Iowa, who nobody is talking about. Sort of the way Rick Santorum won in 2012. No one was paying attention to Rick Santorum until like 3 days before. And also, when you vote in Iowa, is everyone familiar with how a caucus works? Because it sucks. You have to devote 4 hours of your night, and you go in a room like this, and a representative from each party will come up and talk about how wonderful their candidate is. And then they'll walk away. And then a moderator will come up and say, okay, everyone stand up who's for John Smith. So you're standing beside your friends and you're like all uncomfortable because you know, like not all of your friends are standing up. And if you don't get a majority in that room, then you have to do it all over again until one person comes out of that caucus. So what will happen is people will take breaks and then they'll come over and like, come on, can you like totally vote for my guy? Because your guy's not gonna win. You don't have enough people. And I mean, people have not talked to each other for years because of, I have a friend who has not talked to his next door neighbor because of Teddy Kennedy and Jimmy Carter. I mean, not talking, still not talking. That was like, what, 1980? So, you know, Iowa, there's only about 120,000 people that vote in that race. And as far as New Hampshire goes, now the interesting thing in Iowa and New Hampshire, though, is that you can cross over vote. So you can be a Republican, or you can be, like I can see this scenario happen. You can be a Democrat in Iowa. The Democrats in Iowa have never particularly loved Hillary. But they do kind of like the Paul family. And Rand Paul is like a different kind of Republican. So they could just go over and caucus for Rand Paul. So you could see a surprise Rand Paul win, who's also from Pittsburgh, by the way. So I don't think this year what happens in Iowa or New Hampshire is going to snowball into one person. I think the race actually begins in South Carolina. You have a much more diverse electorate. You can also crossover vote. And then I think the SEC primaries, anybody familiar, watch SEC football? Yay. Okay, best college football out there. So the SEC primary is basically around all these southern states who are all in the SEC football, collegiate football. And I think that's when you're going to start, and that's not until March 1st. So I think we have a long time before we understand who the Republican nominee is going to be. I don't think it's going to be until March when that big sort of super Tuesday happens that we start to see how voters react.
Will you permit me to ask a tough question?
Yeah.
A lot of people don't trust the press. And it seems repeatedly in what you're suggesting to us is that the election isn't over. The people that lead the polls will not win. And you seem to be consistently implying that this is going to be a close election. But couldn't one suggest that the press wants us to believe that in order to drum up interest in reporting on the election?
Wait, drum up what I'm saying, me, or what other people
Well,
say?
to get readership. and
Because
to
I'm saying
pay-
like the opposite of what everybody else is saying. Everybody else is
Well-
saying like Trump's going to win.
Right, but you're being dismissive of the folks that are actually leading the polls.
I'm not being dismissive. I'm being dismissive of the notion that this race is over. It's
Correct.
not over. It's
So that's
incredibly
my question.
fluid.
So that's my question. Correct. However, the science, which you were dismissive of, you said
Not
Dr.
at all.
Well,
I'm looking at
Dr. Rice.
history.
You said Dr. Rice is wrong.
Huh?
You said Dr. Rice was wrong in her prediction.
Well, it was a prediction. It wasn't science.
You're making predictions too, are you not?
I said it's not. I don't know what happens. I would be an idiot to say that I knew personally. I would hold myself accountable to say this is what's going to happen in November of 2016 because I don't know. None of us know. I would argue that none of you know who you are definitely going to vote for. Does
Oh.
anybody know, like, completely, without a doubt, they're completely know who they're going to vote for today?
Of course they do. They're just not being honest. They know which party they're going to vote for. They don't know who they're going to vote for.
Well, that's completely
But
different.
you're being dismissive of the science. The
I
science has predicted.
I will disagree with you.
Well, let me finish my point. The science has predicted every modern presidential election, every single one, by June of the election cycle. Did you know that?
The science.
So
is
how can
all-
you say then the science cannot predict the election?
I just don't believe that. I believe
You
that
don't
this
believe.
is a Well, look, I'm out there covering this.
Right.
Are
and-
you out there talking to people?
Yes, and
Are you in
researching
Iowa, New
and
Hampshire?
analyzing the data.
It's not all about data. Look, last night. No, okay, well, you want to talk about science? Let's talk about
Well,
science.
I asked a
no,
tough question.
Let's talk about science. Going into the Kentucky governor's race last night, Conway was ahead by 5 to 9 percentage points by every political science, by every poll. He lost by 9. Where are those 14 points?
Okay, you cannot blur political science with the polling data. Those are not the same thing.
I understand that.
I'm not sure you do because you just blurred them together. The science is separate from polling data. But anyway, I want you to answer the question. The vested interest that the press has in covering campaigns, isn't it to suggest that campaigns are going to be close? Don't you want that conclusion repeatedly? You don't want the conclusion to be the election is over because then no one listens to the audience or the news coverage or the reporting, et cetera, et cetera.
My job is to report what's happening, and I'm reporting
Dismissively, because you.
No, I'm really,
Trump and Ben Carson.
I completely disagree with your attitude about me being dismissive because I'm not being dismissive. I'm saying that we are in a very fluid moment, and that I would argue that everything is up in the air. I don't think that's dismissive. I think that's fact.
Well, you don't. Well, I think we. My apologies, but
Don't
I just wanted to ask you
apologize.
a tough question for the sake of intellectual discussion.
All right. I don't know whether you know my background or not, but I've taught probably 6,000 men in the city of Pittsburgh, who are the judges, and I taught constitutional law to them. I've been in politics for years. I came here today to hear her. I was introduced to her by Steve Zappala, your district attorney, about 5 years ago at the polls over at the Union Building, where I'm a Democratic committee woman. And he kept saying, this woman, she's a writer, she's a writer. And then I started reading what she said. I have a master's in European history. I have taught U.S. history. I have a big background in history. When she mentioned Andrew Jackson, and then when she mentioned the Whiskey Rebellion, Washington stayed at the state line and sent Alexander Hamilton in as the
Who's
the
my
man to
favorite
come.
founding father,
Yes,
by the way?
right. The one they want to take off the
I know.
bill. But anyway, just to tell you, I have a background. I know, actually, I found out I know quite a lot. I understand everything you said. I've studied and taught it. She is the best writer I have ever seen. And the reason I read what she says, it always amazed me that she had this enormous background and understanding. And she is observing, sifting, and giving it to you like it is. And this is one of the things I used to have a problem with a lot of teachers I taught with. They come down, they read books. They don't get out and they don't talk to the people. They're not involved. Because I remember as a first-year teacher in the state of North Carolina, I looked at the scores the students were making. I organized every teacher in the state, went to the Raleigh, which is where all the teachers were paid there, and I asked for 25% more money for education for every person in the state and schools. We didn't have private schools there. At that time, that's when I began to learn about what is out there and what you can do. And the one thing is always open it up and get involved. But you need to get out there because whatever you're reading, if you don't have the experience, you have no understanding.
Thank you.
And
that
I think
was really
you're
kind of
wonderful.
you. Thank you. Hey guys, any more questions? Thanks for staying awake during this. I really appreciate it.
Well, that's Dr. DePlato's job to wake them up. Thanks so much for coming, Salena, and
Thank you.
for encouraging our students to read newspapers. I noticed that you referred to Donald Trump as an entertainer rather than a businessman,
Yeah.
a characterization he probably wouldn't.
I can't dispute that.
Yeah. Well,
Well, yeah,
I wonder
that's
why
true.
you
Yeah.
make that choice.
I guess that's how how I see him, because of the way he runs his campaign. He doesn't run it as a businessman. He runs it as someone who is entertaining and capturing your audience. If you take a look at what he's done with Jeb Bush and now Marco Rubio, he has done a really incredible job of just making them, again, this is class warfare. This is what the Obama 2012 election was very good at, is sort of making these candidates so offensive in your head that you either don't vote at all or you vote for someone else. Now, he's been very successful with that with Jeb Bush. He's just started that with Marco Rubio. It'll be interesting to see if he's successful. One candidate I would say for you guys to really pay attention to, and who's not getting a lot of attention, but I think will, and that's Chris Christie of New Jersey. Especially the last two speeches he gave last night in New Hampshire on heroin addiction and criminal justice. Really powerful stuff. It's certainly worth taking a look at. We good? Okay. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you very much.